Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett. Those of you who are familiar with my research know I've never shied away from controversial areas, and this video is about a pretty controversial area of UFO research, I would say. It's about UFOs that hover over graveyards. Not only hover, but very low level, sometimes land. In a few cases there are humanoids seen. These cases are coming from researchers all over the world. So there's definitely some connection there. Not sure what it is, but thought I'd take a little look at some of these cases. A really interesting case took place on May 7th, 1967 at the Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Edmonton in Alberta, Canada. The main witness is 14-year-old Ricky Banyard. He and his friend Glenn saw this UFO hovering over the graveyard. They described it very much like a typical flying saucer with two bowls stuck together, and it was sending down beams of light into the graveyard for some time. The next day they examined the graveyard, and sure enough there were strange burn marks among the graves, which was verified actually by the cemetery foreman, Joseph Laforge. A lot of cases like this. One case comes from Jim and Coral Lorenzen, also in 1967. They heard from a lady who owned a funeral parlor. She said her son came running in one day and said there was a UFO hovering over the building. She didn't believe him, but several days later, a gentleman had come to visit a loved one's grave site, came running in and said there was a UFO hovering over the graveyard. By the time she got outside, it was gone. But apparently this place was targeted twice. So there's definitely some kind of interest there. An excellent case involving a UFO hovering over a graveyard comes from J. Allen Hynek. He's obviously a pioneering researcher in this field. He discusses a case which occurred on March 8th, 1967 in Leominster, Massachusetts, to a young couple who decided to go driving and look at the scenery, and were driving by the local cemetery when they noticed an object, a lighted object, hovering very low above it. There was a weird, strange fog covering the cemetery in only that area, so it was very strange. They drove up to it and pulled the car over alongside the road right at the cemetery. He got out of the car, he left the car running, and he pointed at the object, at which point he felt an electric shock. His arm was pinned back to the top of the car, and he was paralyzed. The car engine failed, the headlights dimmed, and the radio became filled with static. After a few seconds, the object lifted up, darted away, and the man was no longer paralyzed. The car engine came back on, and they drove away. So clearly, this UFO was doing something in the graveyard that it didn't want them to see. That's what it looks like. Researcher Raymond Fowler, also a pioneering and well-respected researcher, says that he's run into several cases involving UFOs over graveyards. One occurred in October 1964. Two young men, Robert Cousy and William Chase, were driving by a graveyard when they saw a metallic silver disc hovering very low. They watched it for about 30 seconds before they became frightened and drove off to tell the police. Many researchers are reporting these types of cases. A great one comes from Jacques Vallée. It occurred on October 9th, 1954, at a cemetery in Pornay-la-Chative, France. 4 children were roller skating near the local cemetery when they saw a disc, either hovering or very low, or landed in the cemetery. Next to it was a very small, short figure. It had dark eyes, was wearing a dark jumpsuit. It spoke to them in some foreign language, shined a blinding light at them, then retreated into its craft, which took off straight up and went away. It's one of the few cases involving actual entities. An alarming case comes from Nova Scotia, Canada, from MUFON director Eugene Frizan. He interviewed a young paper boy who decided to take a shortcut through the local cemetery and apparently came upon a landed UFO. It was fairly large, metallic. It lifted up as he approached and went right over his head. He felt a blast of heat. He ran home. By the time he got home, he had blisters all over his face and his chest. So the UFO apparently burned him. Another case occurred on November 4th, 1957, to two police officers and a fireman who were on patrol and had been sent to the scene of a possible crime when they started to pass by the local Elmwood Cemetery, where they saw a very large, glowing, egg-shaped object hovering in place. As they approached, their headlights began to dim, and their spotlight also began to dim and flicker. This object quickly shot upward about 200 feet and then darted off very quickly. An article about the incident was actually published in the local newspaper. So I don't know how many cases there are like this, but there's a lot. One case comes from actually the famous celebrity, a musician by the name of Rob Zombie, who told a journalist that back in 1973 he saw a UFO hovering over the graveyard that was not too far from his school. A case reported to MUFON comes from a lady who was driving by the Chillicothe Cemetery in Chillicothe, Illinois, when her radio started to become staticky. She pulled over because she saw these two large glowing orange objects at very low level over the cemetery. She saw other people had also pulled over and were watching these objects, which stayed for only a few moments and started to move away when helicopters approached and actually chased them away. Scott Corrales is a prominent UFO researcher and one of the few people who've actually looked into these types of cases. He's uncovered a number of them, actually. One occurred in Brazil on April 5th, 1996, when a mother and son came upon a landed UFO, and it quickly took off and went right over their car, so low they thought it was going to actually hit their car. The mother was so emotionally traumatized that she had to be sent to the hospital. Another case from Scott Corrales occurred in Sao Paulo, Brazil, at a large graveyard. This was in 1989 when a gravedigger saw a metallic object, aluminum looking, shaped like a hat, hovering at very low level over the cemetery. Another case from Scott Corrales occurred to two couples who were in Spain and saw this red glowing object landed in the graveyard near their home. They watched it for a few minutes when it suddenly took off straight up and was gone. A case from England, again, it's all over the world. On July 15th, 1996, a young man was walking home when he saw a yellow object at very low level, treetop level, he said, hovering over the cemetery, and it was sending down beams of light. It frightened him badly, so he ran home, got his dad, they called the police, and they met there at the cemetery. The UFO was gone, but they did find some pieces of wood, big railway sleepers that had strange 4-inch holes burned through them, and they were still smoldering. Some people have caught photographs of these things over graveyards. A famous incident, well, not famous, but this case was reported to MUFON. It occurred on June 6th, 2006. A group of ghost hunters were doing a stakeout at Alt Cemetery in Alt, Colorado, when a UFO showed up. It looked like a UFO. It was a glowing kind of saucer-shaped object. One of them had a camera, which he quickly snapped a photo of and submitted it to MUFON. Another photograph was taken in February 2000 by Cindy Corriveau, a prominent paranormal researcher who was visiting a graveyard in Wethersfield, Connecticut, and thought she saw some figures, small figures, out in the distance in the graveyard, and looking up saw a glowing object and quickly snapped 3 pictures. So there are people who have photographed these things for sure. Probably the biggest case of this kind comes from veteran journalist Bob Tietz, who reported about an incident like this in his book, West Virginia UFOs. There was these 3 adjoining cemeteries, Nethkin Cemetery, Calbo Cemetery, and most importantly here, Dean Memorial Cemetery. Throughout the 1960s and the 1970s and beyond, there were numerous sightings of objects over these cemeteries. Large glowing objects, metallic objects. One couple drove by the cemetery, saw a UFO. It actually followed their car. People have watched this from their homes. It became so predictable, they started doing UFO stakeouts. A very famous incident occurred on October 8th, 1967, when 3 people were doing a UFO stakeout. One of them was a reverend, and sure enough, a classic flying saucer showed up, and they watched it send down a beam of light and target one of the graves. They noticed that that was actually a freshly dug grave. The person had been buried that very day. This was a pattern that turned up on other instances where the UFO appeared to target freshly dug graves. So yeah, I mean, a lot of cases. I know of several others. One in June 8th, 2011, a man in Illinois heard his dog barking strangely, went outside and saw a UFO hovering over the graveyard at the end of the street. Another case in December 1966 where a whole family observed a UFO land in the local cemetery. So yeah, a lot of cases. The question, I think, is why? What's going on here? These are very low-level sightings. They're often landing. We've seen humanoids in these cases. Sometimes the grave sites are actually disturbed. Scott Corrales, who's looked into this, as I mentioned, speculates that perhaps the ETs are retrieving their implants. My first thought when I heard about these cases was that they were perhaps harvesting genetic material. Someone asked me after I'd published, an article on this, whether they might be harvesting souls. Another thought perhaps they're doing autopsies. Whatever the explanation, these cases like these show that UFOs definitely show an interest in cemeteries and graveyards. Raymond Fowler had a case in the summer of 1964, which he investigated with well-known UFO researcher Walter Webb, where a UFO had landed in a cemetery in Lawrence, Massachusetts. It had been seen by 2 young boys, and the researchers, Fowler and Webb, actually did a stakeout in the cemetery, didn't see anything, but they later learned that the police were also staking out that cemetery because on the same week that the children had seen the UFO, there had been a gravesite that had been robbed. So perhaps that's what we're seeing here is, alien grave robbers. I hate to say it, but these cases kind of speak for themselves. Back in 2002, I wrote an article about it for Fate magazine. They rejected it, so I sent it off to the MUFON Journal, who published it. When I next got the issue of Fate magazine, their next issue, there was an article there by Scott Corrales, also talking about UFOs over cemeteries. So we had both stumbled upon the West Virginia Dean Memorial Cemetery case at the same time and started looking into this, and both found a bunch of cases. Since then, there's been a lot more cases. I've made a complete study of these, which I've published in my book, Not From Here, Volume 1. So if you want to, I'm not sure why UFOs are targeting graveyards. Again, I've got my theories. I do know one thing for sure. With so many cases, it's only a matter of time before it happens again. So once again, thanks for listening and keep having fun.